A normal morning at a Los Angeles hospital turns into chaos when a millionaire snaps and stomps on his pregnant wife's stomach right there in the hallway. Her scream cuts through the silence, echoing off the white walls, and before anyone can move, a doctor sprints from the far end of the corridor, grabs the man by the shoulders, and slams him against the wall. The crowd gasps. The security camera blinks red, and in that split second, everything changes. What follows is not just a story about violence, but about truth, justice, and a woman who refuses to be broken. Stay with me, because when the footage leaks, the entire nation takes sides. Tell us what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to drop a comment below. The noon light poured through the tall windows of Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles, turning the polished floor into a mirror of brightness. Everything was quiet, except for the distant hum of machines and the steady rhythm of footsteps. Grace Holloway sat on a cushioned chair near the consultation desk, her hands folded gently over her rounded belly. Her light sky-blue maternity dress looked almost translucent under the fluorescent glow. She was 7 months pregnant, calm, careful, and visibly exhausted. What should have been a simple prenatal visit had already stretched longer than expected. Her husband, Leonard Holloway, stood beside her, his posture stiff, his face expressionless. The doctor had just stepped out to prepare a report on Grace's latest ultrasound. The moment the door closed, Leonard's calm cracked like glass. "Another test, another expense," he muttered, his voice cutting through the sterile air. "Every time I turn around, there's a new bill, a new excuse to spend my money." His words were low at first, but bitterness made them rise. Grace looked up quickly, her voice soft but firm. "Leonard, please. It's not just another test. The doctor said the baby might need special monitoring. My pressure is a little high. It's for her safety." "Her safety," he repeated with a cold laugh. "You're already deciding she's a girl. You don't even know that for sure." The doctor saw it clearly. Grace's voice trembled. "We're having a daughter." Leonard's face changed. The polite public mask he always wore disappeared, replaced by something darker. "A daughter," he said slowly. "You mean a useless mouth to feed? You think I built everything I have to end up with some little girl who'll just take what's mine?" Grace pressed a hand to her belly instinctively. The baby moved, startled by the tension in her mother's body. She took a careful breath, hoping to calm the storm she knew too well. "Leonard, please, don't do this here. People are watching. I don't care who's watching." His voice grew louder, bouncing off the hallway walls. A nurse turned her head, hesitated, and quickly looked away. "You think because I have money, you can waste it like water? Private hospital, organic food, personal trainer, special vitamins. You live like a queen while I pay for your comfort." "No." Grace looked around, desperate for the doctor to return. The hospital corridor that had felt safe now felt too bright, too open. She lowered her head, trying to shield herself from his glare. "It's not about comfort, it's about our child." "Stop saying that," he snapped. "Stop acting like you care about this baby more than I do. You don't even know what sacrifice means." He took a step closer, his shadow stretching across her dress. "You're pathetic, Grace. You've turned pregnancy into a stage performance." Her voice broke. "Leonard, please stop." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you can embarrass me in public? You think I'll let you make me look weak?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not trying to embarrass you." His words came out as a hiss. "You already did." He stepped back, his jaw tightening, his hands flexing, as if trying to contain something he could no longer control. Then, in one violent motion, he shoved the chair with his leg. The chair struck her shin, and Grace stumbled backward. Her heel slipped on the smooth tile. She fell hard, gasping, one hand clutching her belly, the other bracing for impact. The sound of her fall echoed down the corridor. A nurse called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" But Grace could not answer. Her breath came in short bursts, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to sit up, to protect the child inside her, but Leonard was already looming over her. "Get up!" he barked. "You're embarrassing yourself." She tried to speak, but the pain in her abdomen silenced her. "Leonard, please! The baby!" Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, disgust, something twisted by pride. "You think you can control me with that baby?" he shouted. Then his body moved before his mind could stop it. He lifted his foot and brought it down toward her stomach. The motion was fast, brutal, final. The sound that followed was not a cry at first, but a single sharp gasp that tore itself from Grace's chest. Then came the scream, raw and terrible, a sound that froze everyone within earshot. Nurses at the far end of the corridor stopped mid-step. A clipboard clattered to the floor. For one suspended second, the hospital seemed to stop breathing. Grace's hands flew to her belly, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. Her face twisted in pain and disbelief. She looked up at him, eyes full of horror, unable to understand how the man who once whispered promises against her hair could do this now. Her scream broke again, louder this time, echoing down the hallway. Leonard's chest heaved, his foot still hovering above the floor as if even he could not believe what he had done. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, his voice small and distant. "You made me angry. You pushed me." From behind, a door burst open. The sound of running shoes on tile cut through the stunned silence. A tall man in blue scrubs appeared, moving fast, his expression a mix of instinct and rage. It was Dr. Ethan Ward, one of the hospital's trauma physicians, broad-shouldered, steady, and built like someone who had seen violence before. His voice thundered through the hallway. "Hey, step away from her!" Leonard turned, startled, but before he could react, Dr. Ward closed the distance between them in 3 powerful strides. His hand grabbed Leonard's shoulder, and in a single controlled motion, he spun him against the wall. The impact reverberated through the corridor. Leonard grunted in shock as the doctor's arm pressed firmly across his chest, pinning him in place. Grace gasped at the sound, her hands still clutching her stomach. Tears rolled down her face, her breathing shallow but steady enough to speak. "Help me," she whispered. Dr. Ward's eyes stayed locked on Leonard. "Don't move," he warned, his tone low and calm but deadly serious. The tension in the air was unbearable. Nurses hovered nearby, afraid to intervene but unable to look away. Leonard's arrogance faltered. He stammered, "You don't know who I am." "I don't care who you are," Dr. Ward said. "You just tried to hurt a pregnant woman. You don't deserve to be anywhere near her." For a long second, no one spoke. The sterile smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air. Then the faint sound of Grace's breathing filled the silence. She was alive. The doctor's grip remained firm, every muscle in his arm taut with controlled restraint. Grace's eyes fluttered open again. Through the blur of tears, she saw Leonard pinned, powerless, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his expression twisted with disbelief. She took a shallow breath and whispered to herself, "It's over." Dr. Ward looked back briefly, his voice softer now. "You're safe. I've got you. Lan." That was where it ended. The corridor that had begun in calm silence now held the echoes of violence, pain, and one woman's broken trust. The doctor's heartbeat thudded in his ears as he stood between the victim and her attacker. Grace lay trembling, her hands still wrapped around the fragile curve of life inside her. The world had stopped moving, and in that stillness, everything had changed. The sound of Grace's scream still echoed faintly through the hallway long after Dr. Ward had pinned Leonard against the wall. The moment had passed, but the air remained heavy, charged with shock. Then the hospital's alarm tone cut through the silence, followed by hurried footsteps. 2 security officers turned the corner, startled by the chaos. "Doctor." Ward released Leonard slowly, but his voice was sharp and clear. "Stay right where you are." The officers moved in at once. Leonard protested weakly, but his defiance was fractured. His expensive watch glinted as one of the guards held his arm. Grace was still on the floor, her breathing shallow, her fingers trembling against the curve of her belly. The blue fabric of her dress had darkened with blood near the hem. Her lips moved, forming words that were almost soundless. "The baby, please." Dr. Ward dropped to his knees beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other checking her pulse. "You're all right, Grace. I need you to stay awake for me. We're going to get you to labor and delivery. Now." He looked up at the nearest nurse. "Call a trauma team. Code OB emergency. We need a stretcher immediately." The nurse dashed off while another crouched beside Grace, holding gauze against her leg where a scrape had opened from the fall. Grace tried to lift her head, but pain shot through her abdomen, forcing her back down. Her face twisted, and her eyes filled with tears. "Please tell me she's still alive." "Aye?" Dr. Ward leaned close enough that his voice came out calm but firm. "We'll find out soon. I need you to breathe slowly and not move too much." He pressed his stethoscope lightly against her belly, listening. The rhythmic pulse of a fetal heartbeat came faint but steady through the device. Relief flickered across his face. "I've got it. The heartbeat's there." Grace exhaled shakily, a soft sob of gratitude escaping her. She clutched the side of his sleeve as if anchoring herself to the sound of his assurance. "Thank God," she whispered. The stretcher arrived, wheels squealing on the tile. The medical team lifted Grace carefully, supporting her head and shoulders. The motion made her wince. She gripped the railing beside her with white knuckles, eyes darting toward Leonard, who still stood under the guard's watch. Their gazes met for a fleeting second. His expression was cold, unreadable. "This isn't what it looks like," he said hoarsely. But no one answered him. The elevator doors opened. Dr. Ward moved with the team, one hand still on Grace's arm. "Vitals stable. Let's keep her flat. Monitor for uterine trauma and internal bleeding." He glanced at the nurse pushing the IV cart. "Prepare fluids. Get Dr. Patel in delivery ready. Tell her this patient is 7 months pregnant and took blunt force to the abdomen." The nurse nodded, already calling the command into her headset. Inside the elevator, the small space filled with beeping monitors and tense breathing. Grace kept her eyes open, staring at the fluorescent lights above. "I can feel her moving," she murmured. "She's still fighting." Dr. Ward gave a brief nod. "That's a good sign. Keep focusing on that. You both got through the worst part." When the doors opened again, the delivery wing burst into motion. Nurses pulled on gloves, wheeled in ultrasound machines, and adjusted the monitors. The air smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline. Grace was transferred onto a hospital bed. Cold gel spread across her stomach, and the monitor screen came alive with grainy movement. The image of a small curled body flickered into view, the faint pulse visible. "She's alive," said the technician. Heart rates elevated but strong. Grace's head turned toward the screen, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "She's fighting," she said again, barely able to speak. "Doctor!" Ward stood beside her, arms crossed tightly, his voice softened. "So are you!" The tension in the room shifted from fear to careful urgency. Dr. Patel, the obstetrician, entered briskly, her eyes moving over the monitors. "We'll keep her for observation for at least 24 hours, she instructed. "There's abdominal bruising and risk of early contractions. We need to prevent stress to the uterus." Grace listened faintly, the words blurring into background noise. Her mind was still stuck in the hallway, hearing her own scream replay like an echo she could not stop. The doctor leaned closer. "Grace, can you hear me? You and your baby are both stable right now. I'm going to give you something mild to ease the pain." Grace nodded weakly. The injection stung, but the warmth that followed was almost comforting. Her breathing began to slow. Through the glass panel of the delivery suite, a nurse spoke with a police officer who had just arrived to take the initial statement. Dr. Ward wiped his hands on a towel, his expression firm but tired. "Tell them they'll need to wait until she's stable. She's been through enough for one day." The nurse relayed the message, and the officer nodded, jotting notes into his pad. Back inside, Grace stared at the ceiling tiles, tracing the repeating pattern as her body began to calm. Her fingers moved slowly over her belly, finding the faint rhythm of movement beneath her palm. "She's still here," she whispered. "She's still with me." Dr. Ward pulled a stool beside her bed. "Do you want me to contact a family member?" She shook her head slightly. "No one." He made sure of that. The doctor's expression darkened, understanding the weight behind her words. He rested his elbows on his knees. "You did everything right today. You survived something no one should ever go through." Grace's eyes met his. There was exhaustion, but also the fragile spark of resolve. "I don't know what happens next," she said quietly. "First," he replied, "you rest. Then you decide what kind of life you want to build for your child, one where fear has no place." The steady heartbeat on the monitor filled the silence between them, each beep a quiet reminder that life had endured. Outside the glass window, the sun had started to set, throwing a warm orange glow across the sterile room. Down the hall, the sound of the elevator opened again. A hospital administrator was speaking to police, her tone sharp and precise. "We have multiple witnesses and full camera coverage of the incident," she said. "The footage shows clear intent. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation." In the room, Grace's eyelids fluttered. She wasn't asleep, but she was fading into a dazed calm, the body's natural retreat from shock. Her last clear thought before the medication pulled her deeper was the sound of her baby's heart echoing in rhythm with her own. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about Leonard's voice, his criticism, or the way he controlled her every move. All that existed now was the slow beeping of the monitor and the quiet certainty that she and her child had survived. "Doctor." Ward stood and adjusted the blanket over her. "You're safe here," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Then he stepped out of the room to speak with the officers waiting in the corridor. The door closed gently behind him, leaving Grace in a pool of golden light. The monitor continued to pulse, steady and alive, the fragile sound of survival filling the silence of the night that was just beginning to fall. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping from the fetal monitor. A soft golden light filtered through the blinds, turning the sterile walls into muted shades of warmth. Grace Holloway lay still on the bed, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. The shock had not fully left her body. Her breathing was slow, shallow, almost mechanical. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and plastic tubing. Outside the glass door, footsteps echoed and hushed voices murmured. A few nurses exchanged looks of disbelief. They had seen patients in pain, but not like this. Not a woman whose injuries came from the man who was supposed to love her. The door opened quietly. Detective Nora Willis stepped inside, a folder tucked under one arm. She was in her late 40s, calm and composed, her badge clipped to a simple navy blazer. She approached the bedside with deliberate gentleness. "Mrs. Holloway," she said softly, "I'm Detective Willis. I know you've been through a lot, but when you're ready, I need to ask you a few questions." Grace turned her head slowly. Her eyes were red and swollen, but they still carried a trace of defiance. "Is he still here?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The detective shook her head. "No, he's being held downstairs for now. He won't come near you again tonight." Grace closed her eyes, relief and disbelief mixing in her chest. "He always said that no one would believe me if I ever spoke up." Detective Willis pulled a chair closer. "Then it's time someone does." She sat, setting the folder on her lap, but not opening it yet. Her voice was calm, patient. "You don't have to rush. I just need to understand what happened before the attack. Start wherever it feels right." Grace stared at the ceiling for a moment before she spoke. "It started with small things. The way he watched me. The way he decided what I should wear, who I could see. At first, it felt like love, like he was protecting me. But it changed." The detective nodded, writing slowly. "When did it start to feel different?" "After I got pregnant," Grace said. "He didn't want a baby. Not really. He wanted control. He checked every doctor's bill, every grocery receipt. He called it discipline. I called it responsibility. I was wrong." Her voice wavered, but she continued. "When I told him the baby was a girl, something in him snapped. He stopped talking to me for a week. Then he started saying I was ungrateful, that I didn't respect everything he'd given me." Detective Willis listened without interrupting. "Has he ever hit you before today?" Grace hesitated. The silence stretched between them. Finally, she nodded. "Once. Last year. He grabbed my arm because I was late for a dinner with his business partners. I had bruises for a week, but he said it was an accident. After that, it was never hitting. It was words. He made me believe it was always my fault. He convinced me that keeping quiet was what a good wife did." The detective's pen stopped moving. Her eyes lifted. "You're not at fault for any of this. What he did today was not an argument. It was assault. And it could have killed both of you." Grace blinked, her throat tightening. When he lifted his foot, I couldn't move. I just froze. It was like my body stopped listening to me. I thought I was going to die. I thought my baby was already gone." Dr. Ward entered quietly, carrying a clipboard. His expression was calm but shadowed by concern. "Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to check on you." He set the clipboard down and examined the monitors. "Heart rate is steady. Blood pressure is improving. The baby's still holding strong." Grace managed a faint smile. "You saved us." Dr. Ward shook his head. "I reacted. You're the one who kept fighting. Most people would have gone into shock and not made it this far." Detective Willis stood. "Doctor, I'll finish up soon. We need her statement for the report, but she can rest after that." He nodded and stepped back toward the door, pausing for a moment. "Grace, if you start to feel any sharp pain, press the call button immediately." Then he left, his presence leaving behind a steady reassurance. Detective Willis sat again. "You said he always controlled the money. Do you have any access to your own accounts?" "No," Grace replied. "He handled everything. Even my paychecks from before we married went into a joint account that he managed. I had a card, but he checked every transaction. If I bought anything without telling him, he'd find out." "Did you ever tell anyone about the way he treated you?" "I tried once. I told my mother that Leonard had a temper. She told me to be patient, that all marriages have bad days, so I stopped trying. I thought maybe I was the problem." Her voice trembled. "But today, when he looked at me like that, I knew it wasn't just anger, it was hate. He hated me for carrying a daughter." The detective leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to protect him anymore. What he did is a criminal act. You're safe now. But I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the start of the argument to the moment Dr. Ward stepped in." Grace took a long, shaky breath. She described every moment in painful detail. The way Leonard shouted about money, the way his words turned cruel, the moment she fell, and the crushing pain when his shoe hit her belly. Tears slid silently down her face as she spoke. The detective wrote without stopping, capturing every word. When Grace finished, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the monitor. Detective Willis closed her notebook slowly. "You were incredibly brave to survive that. I'm going to file an immediate report for domestic violence and attempted assault on a pregnant woman. That's a felony. He'll be facing serious charges." Grace stared at her hands. "He always said he could make anything disappear, that he had lawyers who could fix every mistake." The detective gave a faint, knowing smile. "Then he's about to find out that some things can't be fixed with money." For the first time since the attack, Grace felt something close to hope. It wasn't bright or loud, but it was there, like a fragile light she could barely hold. Dr. Ward returned briefly to check the monitor one last time. The baby's heartbeat thudded softly through the room, steady as a drum. Grace listened to it, letting the sound fill the emptiness inside her. Detective Willis stood, gathering her folder. "I'll be back in the morning. You don't have to do anything tonight except rest." Grace nodded. "Thank you." When the detective left, the room felt different. Not peaceful yet, but stronger, grounded. Grace shifted her hand over her stomach. The small movements beneath her palm were faint but real. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Outside, night had fallen over Los Angeles. The hospital lights reflected against the dark sky, their glow steady and unwavering, much like the new strength beginning to rise inside her. The following morning began with the quiet hum of air conditioning and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes. Grace Holloway was awake, sitting upright in her hospital bed. Her body still ached, but her mind was sharper than it had been the night before. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leonard's face as he raised his foot. The image replayed endlessly, sharp and cruel, refusing to fade. The door opened with a smooth click. A woman in a fitted black suit stepped in, her heels tapping softly against the tile. Her perfume carried the faint scent of lilies and confidence. She looked polished, composed, and expensive. "Mrs. Holloway," she said with a practiced smile. "My name is Catherine Bloom. I represent your husband, Leonard Holloway. He asked me to come check on you and make sure you are comfortable." Grace stared at her for a moment before replying. "Comfortable is not the word I'd use." Her tone was calm, but there was a coldness behind it. Catherine didn't flinch. She set her leather briefcase on the side table and folded her hands neatly. "I'm aware this has been a very difficult 24 hours for you. The incident yesterday was deeply unfortunate, but Leonard is extremely concerned about your well-being and the well-being of the baby." Grace's jaw tightened. "Is that what he told you to say?" Catherine smiled again, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "He told me to make sure you understand all of your options before this situation escalates unnecessarily. Mr. Holloway is prepared to cover every medical cost, every future expense, and any additional support you might require. He's also open to public acknowledgement of responsibility, quietly, of course." Grace looked at her in disbelief. "You mean he'll pay me to stay silent?" The lawyer tilted her head slightly. "I would not phrase it that way. What we're discussing is a resolution that avoids unnecessary legal complications, emotional distress, and unwanted publicity. This is a private matter between husband and wife. It doesn't need to become a public spectacle. Grace's voice rose slightly. He tried to kill our baby. Catherine's tone remained even, almost soothing. He lost control of his temper. It happens. Stress, pressure, emotional strain. None of that excuses the act, of course, but context matters. My client is already arranging therapy and anger management counseling. He wants to make things right. Grace turned her gaze to the window, sunlight reflecting on her pale face. He doesn't get to make things right. Not after that. Catherine opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were several typed pages with neat signatures at the bottom. This agreement outlines financial arrangements for your continued care, as well as a formal apology letter for public record if necessary. In exchange, you agree not to pursue criminal charges or civil action. Grace's fingers gripped the blanket. Her heartbeat picked up in the monitor beside her. You think I would sign that? The lawyer's voice softened, carrying the tone of reason. You've been through a terrible ordeal. Stress like this can be very dangerous for the baby. If the media gets involved, it could prolong your trauma. Leonard wants peace for both of you. Grace let out a short, bitter laugh. Peace for him, you mean? Catherine adjusted her posture slightly, still composed. You may not believe this now, but your husband deeply regrets what happened. He's not a monster. He's a man who made a mistake. Grace met her eyes. A mistake is spilling coffee. What he did was a choice. Before the lawyer could reply, the door opened again. Dr. Ethan Ward entered, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly at Catherine before speaking. Everything all right in here? Catherine turned with a polite nod. Dr. Ward, I was just having a brief conversation with Mrs. Holloway about her options moving forward. Her options? His tone was flat. I didn't realize being assaulted came with negotiation terms. Catherine's professional composure didn't waver. Doctor, I'm simply ensuring my client's wife is aware of the resources available to her, including full medical coverage, emotional counseling, and a generous settlement that protects both parties. Dr. Ward stepped closer to Grace's bedside. The only thing she needs protected right now is her and her child's safety, and I'd appreciate if you didn't bring her stress levels any higher than they already are. The lawyer gathered her papers calmly. I'll make a note of your concern, doctor. She turned back to Grace. Think carefully about what you want, Mrs. Holloway. Legal battles can take years. They can drain your finances and your health. Sometimes, the kindest choice is to end things quietly and move on. Grace looked up, her voice steady now. Quietly is how he's gotten away with everything his whole life. For the first time, Catherine's mask faltered slightly. You sound certain of that. I am, Grace said, and I'm done keeping his secrets. Catherine's eyes narrowed briefly, then she straightened, returning to her professional tone. Then I have done my duty. I'll inform my client that you declined the offer. I only hope you won't regret this decision when the reality of the court system becomes clear. Dr. Ward's voice cut through the tension. I'll make sure she doesn't have to face it alone. Catherine snapped her briefcase shut, her movements crisp and efficient. Good day, Doctor, Mrs. Holloway. She left without another glance, the click of her heels fading down the hall. For a long moment, silence filled the room again. The faint beeping of the monitor was the only sound. Grace exhaled slowly, her body trembling from the effort of holding herself together. They really think money fixes everything, she said quietly. Dr. Ward placed the clipboard on the counter and leaned against the foot of the bed. People like him believe money can erase any damage they cause. But this isn't something he can buy his way out of. Grace looked down at her hands. The hospital light made her wedding ring gleam, mocking her. Slowly, she pulled it off and set it on the table. Then he's about to learn that lesson. Dr. Ward gave a small nod. Good, because after what he did, the law is on your side. And this hospital has enough witnesses and video evidence to make sure justice actually happens. Grace's lips pressed together, her voice almost a whisper. I'm scared. That's normal, he said. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about standing anyway. Grace turned toward the window again. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, staining the city skyline in orange and pink. For the first time since the attack, she felt something shift inside her. It was small and fragile, but real. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something stronger, a quiet resolve that would not fade this time. Dr. Ward checked the monitor one last time. "You're stable. Rest as much as you can tonight. Tomorrow, the police will take your full statement. After that, this moves into their hands." Grace nodded. "I'll be ready." He gave a faint smile. "That's good to hear." When he left, the room settled into calm again. Grace looked at the ring lying on the table. The gold surface caught the last light of the setting sun before dimming as the shadow of evening crept across the room. She whispered to herself, "No more silence." No. The faint sound of her baby's heartbeat pulsed through the monitor, steady and strong, echoing the promise she had just made. The day had begun with fear, but it ended with a decision. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a mother preparing to fight back. Morning sunlight spilled across the polished floor of the hospital hallway, glinting against the silver lettering on the door marked "Patient Consultations." Inside, Grace Holloway sat upright in a chair opposite Detective Nora Willis. Her face was pale but steady, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The worst of the physical pain had eased, but the silence between questions carried its own weight. The detective's notebook lay open on the table, half filled with neat handwriting from the night before. Grace's testimony was now official. The next steps were legal. Outside the glass door, movement stirred. The hinges creaked softly, and a figure entered without knocking. It was Catherine Bloom again, dressed in a new charcoal gray suit, her posture sharp and unyielding. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood another man in a navy blazer, carrying a briefcase embossed with the initials L.H. Detective Willis straightened slightly. "This is a private consultation," she said. Catherine's tone was smooth, practiced, and polite. "Detective, this is Mr. Holloway's financial counsel, Mr. Donnelly. He's here to clarify a few matters on behalf of my client. We want to prevent any unnecessary legal escalation." Grace looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "You're here to protect him again." Catherine smiled faintly, as if speaking to a child who misunderstood. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm here to protect both parties from irreparable harm. Your husband made a terrible mistake, but dragging this through court, through months of media exposure, will only hurt you and your child." Detective Willis folded her hands calmly. "This conversation can proceed only if Mrs. Holloway wishes to continue it." Grace's eyes flicked toward the detective, then back to the lawyer. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Let's hear what he's offering now." Catherine opened a thin folder. "Leonard wishes to demonstrate his remorse through immediate action. He's prepared to provide full financial support for both you and the baby, including housing, medical coverage, and a trust fund that ensures lifelong stability. He'll also begin therapy immediately and make a public donation to a women's health foundation. In return, you'll agree not to pursue criminal charges or media involvement." Grace blinked slowly. "A trust fund," she repeated, as if testing the words. "So my silence has a price." The man beside Catherine, Mr. Donnelly, spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Holloway, please understand, this is standard practice in high-profile domestic disputes. It protects reputations on both sides." Grace's voice sharpened. "The only reputation I care about right now is my daughter's safety." Catherine's expression didn't falter. "Safety comes in many forms. Financial stability is one of them. Without this agreement, you'll face court hearings, depositions, public scrutiny. That kind of stress can affect your health, even your pregnancy." Detective Willis interjected. "You're suggesting that pressing charges could harm her baby. That's dangerously close to coercion, counselor." Catherine met the detective's gaze coolly. "I'm simply reminding her of medical reality. Stress can have consequences." Grace looked down at her trembling hands. The memory of Leonard's shoe striking her belly flickered behind her eyes. Every word Catherine spoke felt like an echo of his manipulation. He used fear as a leash, and now his lawyer was holding the same rope. When Grace spoke again, her voice was quiet but firm. "Tell him he doesn't need to worry about public scrutiny. He should have thought about that before he attacked me in a hospital full of cameras." "Mo." Catherine's lips thinned. "You understand that once this goes public, the media will dissect every detail. They'll question your motives, your behavior, even your past. The story will stop being about what he did and start being about who you are." Grace's fingers gripped the edge of the chair. Let them ask. Let them see everything. I have nothing to hide anymore. Dr. Ethan Ward appeared at the doorway, his expression unreadable. Am I interrupting something? Detective Willis motioned for him to enter. Perfect timing! We were just listening to another settlement proposal. The doctor's gaze landed on Catherine. You again. Does your client think he can buy his way out of this? Catherine closed the folder calmly. Dr. Ward, you've already involved yourself enough. This isn't your concern. It became my concern the moment I saw a man try to harm a pregnant woman under my care, he said evenly. Catherine's tone remained smooth. Leonard is already cooperating with therapy and willing to make amends. Surely, as a doctor, you can understand rehabilitation. Dr. Ward's eyes narrowed. Rehabilitation requires accountability first. I haven't seen any yet. Mr. Donnelly cleared his throat. This is getting unnecessarily adversarial. We're here to extend an olive branch, not start another fight. Grace looked at him. An olive branch wrapped in a contract and silence. You come. The detective nodded slowly, closing her notebook. This meeting's over. Mrs. Holloway has made her position clear. Catherine exhaled softly, then turned toward Grace. Think carefully before you refuse. Once this moves to court, the process will be brutal. The lawyers he hires will be relentless. They'll question your emotional stability, your fitness as a mother, and your motives for pressing charges. Grace looked directly at her, unblinking. You mean they'll lie? Catherine paused, then gave a small, restrained smile. They'll defend him. Dr. Ward stepped forward slightly. Mrs. Holloway has already endured the worst part. There's nothing your team can threaten her with that she hasn't already survived. Grace took a long breath. Her pulse steadied. You can tell Leonard he can keep his money, his lawyers, and his fake apologies. I'll take justice instead. The lawyer gathered her papers with deliberate calm, slipping them back into her briefcase. Very well, but remember, once this is public, you can't take it back. Grace's reply came without hesitation. I don't want to. When they left, the door closed softly behind them. The sound was final, like a seal on a choice that could no longer be undone. Detective Willis looked at Grace, her tone gentler now. That was brave. You just told one of the most powerful attorneys in this city that you can't be bought. Grace let out a shaky breath. I used to think silence protected me. It only protected him. Dr. Ward leaned against the counter, arms folded. You just took the hardest step. The rest will be painful, but at least it's honest pain, not the kind that eats you alive in secret. Grace nodded. The tension in her shoulders loosened slightly. What happens next? The detective stood, tucking her notebook under her arm. I'll finish the official report and forward it to the district attorney. The charges will include aggravated assault and attempted harm to an unborn child. From there, the state takes over. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. The state, she repeated softly. It's not just me anymore. Exactly, the detective said. You're not alone in this. As the two professionals left the room, Grace sat back in the chair. The late afternoon sun painted the walls in soft gold. The baby moved faintly beneath her palm, a quiet reminder of why she couldn't give in. The ring she had removed earlier still lay on the table, catching the light. She stared at it for a long time before reaching over and placing it inside an empty plastic cup. The sound was small but sharp, a clean break from everything that came before. Grace whispered into the stillness, her voice low but certain. He can keep his money. I'll keep my soul. The faint heartbeat on the monitor pulsed steadily beside her, each soft beep echoing like a promise that this time she wouldn't back down. The first ripple began early the next morning. At 7 a.m., a video appeared on a small social media page for hospital workers. Within minutes, it was shared again, and by noon, it had reached every major platform in the country. The footage was only 40 seconds long, taken from a hallway security camera. It showed Leonard Holloway raising his foot and bringing it down toward his pregnant wife's stomach, followed by Dr. Ethan Ward rushing in and forcing him against the wall. The audio was faint, but Grace's scream could be heard clearly. It cut through the static like something alive, something impossible to forget. By midday, the clip had gone viral. Television anchors interrupted scheduled programs with breaking news. The words flashed across every screen in bold red. Millionaire real estate mogul attacks pregnant wife inside Los Angeles hospital. News helicopters hovered above Memorial Hospital. Reporters crowded outside the emergency entrance. Every major talk show replayed the footage, blurring Grace's face but keeping the violence visible. The outrage was immediate. Across America, thousands of comments poured in. Some were short and furious. How could anyone do this? Others came from women who had lived their own silent stories. I was her once. No one believed me then, but we believe her now. Hashtags multiplied by the minute. Number, Justice for Grace. Number, Stop the Silence. Number, No Excuse for Violence. The tone of the internet shifted from gossip to moral uprising. Even those who did not know her name shared the same message. There was no justification, no defense, no excuse. Inside a downtown office tower, Leonard's public relations team worked in panic. His media strategist, Greg Sullivan, paced between phone calls, barking orders. "We'll call it an edited video. We'll say it's been manipulated," he said. Assistants typed feverishly, drafting statements for online release. Within an hour, the first headline appeared on a business website. Sources claim Holloway footage misleading. Leonard approved the draft without reading. "Do whatever it takes," he snapped. "I'm not letting this destroy me." But it was already too late. By afternoon, nurses from the maternity wing had confirmed the footage was real. One of them, interviewed anonymously on a live broadcast, said she had been there. Her voice shook but did not waver. "He attacked her. We all saw it. The doctor saved her life." That single statement unraveled every attempt at denial. Grace remained in her hospital room, unaware at first of how large the story had become. She had refused to look at her phone since the night before. When Dr. Ward came in to check her vitals, his tone was careful. "The news has the video," he said quietly. "It's everywhere now." She froze. "Everywhere?" He nodded. "People are angry. The world's finally seeing what he did." Her mind spun. She imagined millions of strangers watching the worst moment of her life, over and over. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but it's out now, and it might be the thing that keeps you safe." By evening, protesters had begun gathering outside Leonard's corporate headquarters. Women held signs that read, "Protect mothers, not monsters, and her pain is our pain." Television crews lined the sidewalks. News anchors interviewed domestic violence advocates, lawyers, and survivors. They spoke about systemic silence, about how power had protected men like Leonard for too long. Meanwhile, Leonard filmed a statement from his penthouse. The curtains were drawn, and his face was pale under studio lights. "The video circulating online," he began, "does not represent the truth. It was taken out of context. My wife has been struggling emotionally during her pregnancy, and I was only trying to help her up after she fell." His voice was smooth, rehearsed, practiced. The video went live on his verified account. It backfired instantly. Comment sections flooded with outrage. Screenshots of his words spread with captions like, "He calls this helping," and "No context excuses cruelty." Influential figures, including television hosts and senators, condemned his statement. Overnight, his corporate sponsors withdrew partnerships. A luxury housing project bearing his name quietly removed its signage. At the same time, Grace's name became a symbol. People across the country left flowers outside hospitals. Strangers painted murals of a woman's silhouette holding her unborn child, with the words, "We hear you, Grace," underneath. Radio hosts read messages from listeners who shared stories of their own survival. The movement that began with one scream had turned into a nationwide demand for accountability. The hospital's administrator came to Grace's room that evening. "Reporters are waiting outside," she said gently. "You can't stay here much longer without them finding you." Grace nodded. "I understand." Dr. Ward arranged for her transfer to a quiet neighborhood in Echo Park, where her friend Emily Park had offered her spare apartment. The hospital staff moved her discreetly through a side exit. The night air outside was cool and smelled faintly of rain. A single camera flash blinked from across the street, but no one followed. Emily opened the door before Grace could knock. She wrapped her arms around her tightly. "You're safe here," she said. "Stay as long as you need." Inside, the apartment was small but warm. A soft yellow lamp lit the corner of the living room. Grace sat on the couch, still in her hospital gown, her hands resting protectively over her belly. Emily placed a blanket over her shoulders and handed her a phone. "You should see this," she said quietly. Grace hesitated before unlocking the screen. Her social media notifications had exploded. Thousands of messages filled the feed. Some were from strangers sending prayers. Others came from women thanking her for surviving, for standing, for screaming. One message caught her eye. "You don't know me, but your strength gave me courage to leave my abuser. Thank you for reminding me that my life still matters." Grace read the words twice. Her vision blurred. Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling silently onto her hands. For the first time, they weren't from fear or pain, but from something else. Recognition. She leaned back into the couch. The sounds of the city faint through the open window. Cars passed on the street below, and somewhere, a dog barked. The glow of the phone screen flickered across her face. She looked out at the skyline, the soft lights reflected in her eyes. "I'm not alone anymore," she whispered. In that moment, the storm outside no longer felt threatening. It felt alive, powerful, and full of voices that refused to be silenced. The world had finally seen the truth, and Grace Holloway, sitting quietly in that small Los Angeles apartment, began to believe that her voice could change more than just her own life. The courthouse in downtown Los Angeles was already surrounded by cameras before sunrise. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder along the steps, their microphones raised toward the crowd that had gathered with signs and posters. The words "Justice for Grace" glimmered in the morning light, printed across cardboard and cloth. Some of the people waiting outside had never met her, yet they spoke her name as if she belonged to all of them. For weeks, the video had haunted the nation. Now, the man in that footage was finally facing the law. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. The marble floor reflected the glare of the fluorescent lights, and the low murmur of voices filled the courtroom until the bailiff called for silence. Grace Holloway sat at the plaintiff's table beside the district attorney. Her blue maternity dress fit neatly around her rounded belly. She looked fragile but composed, her back straight, her hands resting gently on her lap. The baby moved once, a faint reminder of the life she was fighting for. Across the aisle, Leonard Holloway entered through a side door. He wore a dark suit and tie, but his eyes were hollow. His face had lost the polished confidence it once carried. The weight of sleepless nights and public outrage hung over him. Catherine Bloom, his lead attorney, leaned in to whisper something, but Leonard stared straight ahead, refusing to respond. The judge entered, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled neatly back. The courtroom rose. "Be seated," she said. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had seen every kind of cruelty, yet never grown numb to it. "We are here today, in the case of the state of California versus Leonard Holloway, charged with aggravated assault, domestic violence, and endangerment of an unborn child." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the state will prove that the defendant knowingly and intentionally assaulted his pregnant wife inside Memorial Hospital. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of violence, one witnessed by multiple hospital staff and captured on security footage." When the video played on the large monitor, the courtroom went silent. The screen flickered, showing the hallway, the bright lights, the figure of Grace collapsing, and Leonard raising his foot. Her scream filled the room. Even though the video had been seen millions of times online, hearing it echo through the solemn quiet of the court struck differently. It was no longer just a headline, it was evidence. Grace looked down as the clip played. She could not watch, but she could feel the memory return like a pulse beneath her skin. When the footage ended, the silence lingered until the prosecutor continued. "The man who appears to help her afterward is Dr. Ethan Ward, who will testify today." Dr. Ward took the stand. He spoke calmly, describing every detail with precision. "I was walking through the maternity corridor when I heard shouting," he said. "When I turned the corner, I saw the defendant standing over Mrs. Holloway. She was on the floor, and he had just brought his foot down toward her abdomen. I reacted instinctively. I restrained him and called for security." Catherine Bloom rose for cross-examination. "Dr. Ward, isn't it possible that what you saw was an accident, that he was trying to help her up after she slipped?" The doctor's tone didn't change. "No, it wasn't an accident. The motion was downward, with full weight. It was an act of aggression." Catherine's lips tightened, but she moved on. "You have a strong sense of justice, Doctor. Is it possible your emotions affected your judgment?" Dr. Ward looked her directly in the eye. If defending a pregnant woman from violence makes me emotional, then yes, but it doesn't make me wrong. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the courtroom before the judge called for order. Next came Detective Nora Willis. She placed a stack of documents on the evidence table. Your Honor, these are records of prior complaints made against the defendant by female employees of his company. The pattern is clear: intimidation, harassment, and retaliation against women who spoke up. 2 were pregnant. 1 lost her child following prolonged verbal abuse. The prosecutor asked her to read a line from one of Leonard's internal emails. Her voice was steady as she read, "Pregnancy is a liability. I hire women who can work, not rest." Gasps rose from the audience. Grace closed her eyes. The judge tapped her gavel once. "Order, please." The defense tried to repair the damage. Catherine called an expert witness, a psychiatrist, who claimed that pregnancy hormones could cause heightened sensitivity and memory distortion. Mrs. Holloway's perception may have been influenced by stress, the expert said. But when the prosecutor asked if that explained the video evidence, the witness hesitated. "No," she admitted quietly. "The video is what it is." The tide had turned. When Grace was called to testify, the room grew still again. She walked slowly to the stand, her steps steady. After taking the oath, she looked toward the jury. Her voice was soft but clear. "He told me I made him angry, that I embarrassed him. I believed him for years. I thought if I stayed quiet, things would get better. But they didn't. And when I saw him lift his foot, I knew there was nothing left to save." Catherine stood. "Mrs. Holloway, is it true you refused my client's settlement offer?" "Yes," Grace said. "Why?" "Because silence is how he survived. I'm done being silent." The lawyer hesitated, then turned away. Leonard's jaw clenched. His composure cracked. "You're lying!" he shouted suddenly. "You're twisting everything! I just wanted to teach you a lesson!" The judge's gavel struck hard. "Mr. Holloway, control yourself or I will have you removed." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling every word. Leonard slumped back into his chair, realizing too late what he had confessed. After hours of testimony, the judge dismissed the court for deliberation. The jury filed out, their faces grave. Grace stepped down from the stand, her knees weak but her expression calm. Dr. Ward met her at the aisle, steadying her with a quiet hand. "You did it," he said. She nodded faintly. "Not yet, but almost." Outside, through the tall courthouse windows, the crowd still waited. Some held flowers, others candles. The sky had turned a soft orange, and the sound of distant chanting carried on the wind. Grace sat on a bench in the hallway beside Dr. Ward and Detective Willis. The exhaustion of the day pressed against her, but beneath it was something steady, a quiet strength she had not felt in years. The detective looked at her and said, "Whatever happens next, you already changed more than you realize." Grace rested a hand on her belly. "Then it was worth it. You come." The camera flashes outside flickered against the glass, like tiny bursts of light breaking through the dusk. Inside, Grace waited for the verdict, her heart steady, her eyes fixed forward. The day she once feared had finally become the day she took her life back. That was where the trial paused. The gavel had fallen, the testimony was done, and the world outside was holding its breath for justice. The morning sun rose over downtown Los Angeles, casting a pale gold light across the courthouse steps. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. Crowds had already gathered before the doors opened, holding flowers, signs, and banners that read "Justice for Grace" and "No More Silence." News cameras stood shoulder to shoulder, reporters whispering updates into microphones. For 3 weeks, the country had waited for this day. Today, the verdict would be read. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and hushed. Grace Holloway sat quietly at the front, her hands resting on her rounded stomach. She wore a soft blue dress, simple and elegant, the same color she had worn the day she testified. Around her, the low hum of whispered conversations filled the air like static before a storm. Dr. Ethan Ward sat a few rows behind her, his expression calm but firm, while Detective Nora Willis stood by the wall, her arms crossed, watchful. Across the aisle, Leonard Holloway entered through the defendant's door. His once sharp suit hung loosely on him now. His face was pale, drawn, almost hollow. The arrogance that once defined his every movement had faded. He looked smaller, diminished, like a man finally realizing that the walls around him were closing in. Catherine Bloom followed him, composed as always, but even her confident stride had lost its rhythm. The judge entered. "All rise," the bailiff called. The entire courtroom stood. Judge Eleanor Brooks took her seat, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. "You may be seated," she said. Her tone carried both strength and solemnity. She looked at the jury, then at the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the weight of this case on our community. Today, we listen." The foreperson of the jury rose, holding a sheet of paper. The sound of it unfolding seemed to echo. Leonard shifted uneasily. Grace did not move. On the charge of aggravated assault, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant, Leonard Holloway, guilty." The words struck the room like a pulse. A hush swept across the crowd. On the charge of domestic violence resulting in bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. Leonard's jaw clenched. On the charge of endangerment of an unborn child, we find the defendant guilty. There was a moment of silence, then a quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Someone sobbed softly in the back row. Grace closed her eyes, her hand pressing lightly to her chest. She did not cry. Her expression was calm, steady, as though the storm had finally passed. Judge Brooks nodded slowly. "The jury has spoken," she said. "Mr. Holloway, please stand for sentencing." Leonard stood, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He looked toward Grace, his eyes dark with anger and disbelief. "This isn't justice," he muttered. "This is revenge." "La?" The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Holloway, what you call revenge, the law calls accountability." She paused, letting her words fill the space. "This court has reviewed the evidence and the testimonies. It has seen the video. It has heard your own words. You used your power to harm, not to protect. You treated your wife and child as possessions, not lives. And today, the law will remind you that no man is above it." Her voice grew firm. "For the charges before this court, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. You are stripped of all paternal rights. You are to have no contact, direct or indirect, with Mrs. Holloway or her child, for life." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Grace's quiet exhale. Leonard's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but no words came. His knees seemed to weaken. 2 officers stepped forward, moving to either side of him. "Take him into custody," the judge ordered. As they reached for his wrists, Leonard snapped, his voice cracking through the silence. "You think this makes you better than me? You all think you're heroes?" He turned toward Grace, eyes wild. "You ruined me." The officers tightened their grip, pulling his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the room. The judge's gavel struck once, firm and final. "Order! Remove the defendant." The doors opened. Reporters craned their necks, cameras flashing. Leonard was led away, struggling against the officers, shouting words no one cared to understand. The heavy doors shut behind him, muffling his voice into nothing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. It was quiet at first, hesitant. Another followed, and then another, until the entire courtroom was filled with the sound of applause. Not for victory, but for relief, for survival, for justice finally delivered. Grace sat still, her eyes glistening, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Dr. Ward approached her gently. "It's over," he said. She looked up at him, her voice soft but sure. "No, it's just beginning." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Reporters stood behind barricades as police guided people into lines. When the doors opened, the cheering erupted. Grace stepped out into the sunlight, flanked by Dr. Ward and Detective Willis. Flashbulbs flickered like bursts of lightning. People held up signs, some crying, others smiling through tears. An elderly woman reached out from the crowd, her hand trembling. Grace paused, took her hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you," the woman said, her eyes wet. "You spoke for all of us." Grace nodded, her lips trembling into a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for believing me." The cameras followed her as she walked down the courthouse steps. The sunlight reflected off the marble columns, surrounding her in a pale halo. Behind her, the crowd chanted, "Justice for Grace." Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried a different weight. It was not fear, it was peace. At the bottom of the steps, Dr. Ward held the car door open. Grace turned once more toward the courthouse, the building that had held her pain and her redemption. A breeze lifted her hair as she whispered quietly, "It's done." In that moment, she felt the baby move again, a soft flutter beneath her palm, as if the child understood. Across every news network that evening, headlines scrolled, "Justice delivered, Leonard Holloway sentenced, the nation listens." And in the quiet that followed, Grace Holloway became more than a name in a courtroom. She became a symbol of what courage could look like when silence finally breaks. The city had changed by the time spring arrived. The streets were quieter, softer, as if Los Angeles itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Months had passed since the verdict, and Leonard Holloway was now behind bars, serving his sentence in a state prison outside San Diego. The story that had once filled every headline had begun to fade, replaced by newer scandals and fresher noise. Yet Grace Holloway's name remained. To many, it meant courage, survival, and truth. To Grace, it meant something simpler. It meant peace. She lived now in a small apartment overlooking Echo Park Lake. The world outside her window felt calm. The scent of blooming jacarandas drifted in through the open balcony door. On the coffee table, a few letters lay unopened, many from strangers who still wrote to thank her. She had stopped giving interviews and stopped watching the news. She no longer needed to hear the world's opinion of her story. She was living its ending in real time. The calendar on the wall marked 38 weeks. Her due date was near. Emily Park, her closest friend, stayed with her often, helping her prepare the nursery and drive to her checkups. The baby's crib was a simple wooden one by the window, draped with a white blanket embroidered with the word Hope. Grace had chosen the name long before the trial ended. She whispered it to her belly every night as a promise. On the morning of March 17th, the first contractions began. Grace was standing by the sink, rinsing a mug, when a sharp pain gripped her from within. It wasn't fear that came, but clarity. She had waited for this moment, for the chance to bring something new into a world that had once tried to destroy her. Emily rushed her to St. Augustine Hospital, the same place where everything had nearly ended months ago. But this time, it felt different. The air was lighter, the faces familiar, the halls no longer haunted. Dr. Ethan Ward met them in the maternity wing. He was in his usual scrubs, calm and reassuring. "You're right on time," he said with a small smile. "Everything looks good. Let's get you settled." Grace nodded, gripping his hand as another wave of pain passed through her. "I can do this," she said through shallow breaths. "You already have," he replied. "Now you just finish it." The delivery room was softly lit. The sound of the fetal monitor filled the space with a steady rhythm. Nurses moved with quiet precision. Emily stood beside the bed, whispering encouragement. The contractions came stronger, closer together. Grace focused on her breathing, her eyes fixed on the clock that ticked softly on the wall. Each second stretched into eternity. She remembered the fear of the first hospital visit, the screams, the chaos. This time, there was none of that. Only strength, only life. Hours passed, and then suddenly everything shifted. The nurse leaned forward, her voice calm but alert. "Almost there, Grace. Just one more push." The room held its breath. And then it happened. The sound that erased every shadow. The sharp, pure cry of a newborn filled the air. The nurses smiled. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Grace lay back, her chest heaving, her eyes wet but bright. "She's here," she whispered. Dr. Ward lifted the tiny child and placed her gently on Grace's chest. The baby's skin was warm and pink, her little fists curling against her mother's heart. Grace looked down, her hands trembling as she stroked the fine hair on the baby's head. "Hi, Hope," she said softly. "Welcome home." The doctor smiled. "She's strong, perfectly healthy. You did beautifully." For a moment, time stopped. The machines hummed quietly, and the golden afternoon light poured through the window. Grace held her daughter close, feeling the heartbeat against her own. She whispered again, "You are the reason I'm still here." Outside the delivery room, the nurses who had been on duty that fateful day gathered near the window. They watched through the glass, their eyes glistening. One of them placed a small bouquet of daisies on the counter with a note that read, "For Grace and Hope, from the night that changed us all." Detective Nora Willis could not attend in person, but she sent a basket of flowers. The card inside carried a single sentence in neat handwriting, "For Hope, proof that light survives." Grace read it later, holding the card between her fingers, her lips curving into a quiet smile. That evening, the world outside glowed in soft orange. The city that had once felt cruel now looked kind. Grace stood by the window, her daughter in her arms, wrapped in a pale blanket. She looked out at the skyline, the sun dipping low behind the palm trees, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. When Dr. Ward entered for the final checkup, he paused for a moment, watching her from the doorway. "How does it feel?" he asked. Grace turned to him, her eyes full. "Like a second chance." He nodded. "You earned it." The next afternoon, Grace was discharged. Emily came to pick her up, carrying a small car seat in both hands. The hospital lobby was calm, sunlight reflecting off the polished floors. A few people recognized Grace but said nothing. They just smiled as she passed. At the entrance, a handful of strangers stood quietly holding flowers. They didn't cheer or shout, they simply nodded in respect as she stepped outside with her daughter. Grace stopped for a moment. The baby nestled against her chest. "Thank you," she said softly to the small crowd. The air was warm, filled with the scent of rain from the night before. As Grace reached the car, she turned once more to look back at the hospital, the place where her life had broken and begun again. The glass doors slid closed behind her, their reflection catching her silhouette, a woman carrying hope into the sunlight. In the car, she cradled her daughter and whispered, "This time, it's a new beginning." As they drove away, the city shimmered around them, alive with light. The baby stirred, her tiny hand gripping Grace's finger. Grace smiled, her heart steady and full. Somewhere behind them, the courthouse, the cameras, the headlines, all faded into memory. Ahead stretched only the road, open and golden, leading toward a future that belonged entirely to them. And in that quiet drive through Los Angeles, Grace Holloway finally felt what she had fought for all along: freedom. A year had passed since the verdict, and Los Angeles had settled back into its usual rhythm. Yet, for many, the story of Grace Holloway had never truly faded. It had become part of the city's pulse, whispered in classrooms, in support groups, and in quiet conversations between mothers and daughters. The storm that once raged around her name had transformed into something calmer, something enduring. It had become a symbol. That morning, the sky was clear, the kind of soft California blue that seemed to promise healing. Outside Riverside Medical Center, a new wing was being unveiled. The plaque at the entrance shimmered in the sunlight, its bronze surface freshly polished. The words were simple but carried weight. The Grace Holloway Healing Wing, dedicated to the strength of survivors. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was alive with quiet celebration. Nurses moved through the corridors carrying flowers and trays of small pastries. Reporters adjusted their cameras, whispering last-minute notes to their producers. Grace walked slowly down the hallway, holding her daughter's tiny hand. Hope toddled beside her, her curls bouncing with each step. She wore a little white dress and held a small bouquet of pale blue flowers that matched her mother's dress. Grace's expression was calm, almost serene. The past year had reshaped her life in ways she had never imagined. She still received letters from women across the country, some thanking her for her courage, others telling her they had finally found the strength to leave their abusers. She answered as many as she could, writing late at night after Hope had fallen asleep. Her handwriting was small and neat, her words always gentle. "You are stronger than you know." As she reached the entrance of the new wing, she saw familiar faces waiting. Dr. Ethan Ward stood near the podium, wearing a light gray suit instead of his usual scrubs. Detective Nora Willis stood beside him, her hands folded, her badge gleaming faintly in the light. A few of the nurses from that night were there too. Their eyes met Grace's, and they smiled warmly. It felt like a full circle closing. The hospital director stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today, we open not just a new facility, but a symbol of what resilience and compassion can build from tragedy. And there is no one more deserving to speak on this occasion than Mrs. Grace Holloway." Applause rippled through the small crowd. Grace took a slow breath and stepped up to the podium. The microphone crackled softly as she adjusted it. She looked out over the audience, seeing faces filled with expectation and kindness. Her voice, when she began to speak, was steady and warm. "I used to think silence kept me safe," she said. "That if I stayed quiet, I could control what happened to me. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the person who hurts you." The room was still. Even the air seemed to pause. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to me," she continued. "That story belongs to the past. I'm here to talk about what came after, about what happens when we decide that fear doesn't get the last word." Lead. She looked down briefly at Hope, who was sitting on Dr. Ward's knee, playing with a flower petal. Grace smiled faintly. "When my daughter was born, I named her Hope because she was the proof that something beautiful can grow out of pain. Every time I look at her, I remember that survival isn't just about living through something. It's about choosing what you'll do with it once you survive." Her eyes lifted again to the crowd. "So many women have told me they saw themselves in my story. They said they were afraid, that they felt invisible. But you're not invisible. You are seen, you are heard, and your voice matters more than you can imagine." A soft murmur moved through the room. Some of the women in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Detective Willis watched from the back, her expression proud and quiet. Dr. Ward stood with his arms crossed, the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. Grace's voice grew stronger. "We built this place for you, for every survivor who walks through these doors and needs to be reminded that her life is still her own. What happened to me does not define me. What I choose to do with it does. And I choose to help others find their way back to themselves." She paused, letting the words settle in the silence. The audience rose to their feet, applause swelling until it filled the room. Cameras flashed. For a moment, Grace closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. It was not the chaos of the past, not the roar of judgment or pity. It was something pure, recognition. When the applause quieted, Grace stepped down from the podium. Hope wriggled free from Dr. Ward's arms and ran to her mother, clutching her small bouquet of blue flowers. Grace knelt down and opened her arm. The little girl ran straight into them, laughing softly. Dr. Ward approached, his voice low. "You were incredible." Grace smiled up at him. "I just told the truth." "No, that's what makes it powerful," he said. Detective Willis joined them, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. "You changed more than a law," she said quietly. "You changed the way people see silence." Grace nodded. "Then it was worth everything." Outside, the midday sun was bright. The hospital courtyard was filled with families, doctors, and reporters. Grace stepped out with Hope in her arms. The light caught the bronze plaque, making the engraved letters shimmer. She walked toward it slowly, knelt down, and placed the small bouquet of pale blue flowers at its base. For a moment, she stood there, her fingers tracing the cool metal surface of her name. The world around her blurred into soft color and sound. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to life itself. Hope tugged gently at her hair, drawing a laugh from her. Grace lifted her daughter higher, kissing her forehead. Together, they turned toward the open courtyard, walking through the golden light. Behind them, the plaque glowed under the sunday. The Grace Holloway Healing Wing, dedicated to the strength of survivors. And as the scene widened, the crowd faded into the hum of city life. The last image was of Grace and Hope, walking hand in hand, framed by light and the endless blue sky. Across the screen, simple white letters appeared. "For every woman who thought she was alone, you are not."
The acrid smell of burnt rubber and gasoline clung to the damp Marin County air. Joel Davis stood on the slick asphalt, the flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles washing over his ashen face. His mistress, Avery, clutched his arm, her knuckles white. Below them, in the ravine, lay the mangled, blackened husk of a Porsche Macan, the very one he'd gifted his pregnant wife, Jeanne, last Christmas. A firefighter's solemn words echoed in his ears. "Single occupant. I'm so sorry, Mr. Davis." A strange, chilling cocktail of grief and relief flooded Joel's veins. It was over. The suffocating marriage, the secrets. It was all over. The call had come at 2:17 a.m., a shrill interruption to the sterile silence of Avery Reed's minimalist apartment in Pacific Heights. Joel had been awake, staring at the ceiling, the ghost of his last argument with Jean playing on a loop in his mind. "You're a shell of a man, Joel," she'd said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "You hide inside this fortress of money and expect it to love you back." He'd snatched the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was the California Highway Patrol, an accident on Panoramic Highway, a vehicle registered in his name. Now, standing at the precipice of the ravine, the reality of it was a physical blow. The Porsche was barely recognizable. Flames had licked the paint clean off, leaving a skeletal frame that glowed orange in the pre-dawn gloom. Avery shivered beside him, her perfectly sculpted face a mask of concern. "Oh, Joel. My God." "Jean," he pulled her closer, playing the part of the devastated husband. It wasn't entirely an act. A part of him, the part that remembered the woman he'd fallen in love with 10 years ago, was screaming. But another, more dominant part, the part that had spent the last year entangled with Avery, planning a new life, felt a sickening, liberating calm. He was free. The universe had just handed him a brutal but clean exit. A stocky, world-weary detective with a salt-and-pepper mustache introduced himself as Detective Harding. His eyes, small and sharp, seemed to miss nothing. "Mr. Davis, we need to ask you a few questions. When was the last time you saw your wife?" "This afternoon," Joel lied, his voice cracking with practiced grief. The truth was he hadn't seen her in 2 days, not since their fight. They had been living in separate wings of their sprawling Sausalito mansion, communicating through cold, terse text messages. She said she was going for a drive, to clear her head. We had a disagreement." He let his voice trail off, inviting the detective to fill in the blanks of a typical marital spat. Harding nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Avery. "And you are?" "Avery Reed. A family friend," she supplied, her voice smooth as silk. "I was with Joel when he got the call. I came to support him." The detective's eyes flickered between them, an unreadable expression on his face. "Right. A family friend." He made a note in his small pad. "We found a purse. The ID says Jean Wilson. We'll need a formal identification later, of course. But for now, we're proceeding under the assumption that the victim is your wife." Each word was a nail in a coffin Joel had long been building. He and Avery were driven back to his mansion, the one John had filled with art and light and warmth. As they stepped into the grand foyer, the silence was deafening. Her scent, a faint trace of lavender and citrus, seemed to hang in the air, a ghostly accusation. "I'll make you some tea," Avery said, her voice a soft murmur as she disappeared toward the kitchen. Left alone, Joel's eyes fell upon a framed photo on the console table. It was from their trip to Italy, 2 years ago, before the rot had set in. Jeanne was laughing, her head thrown back, the Tuscan sun catching the gold in her hair. She looked radiant, alive, full of a hope he had systematically extinguished. A wave of genuine, gut-wrenching guilt washed over him. He had been planning to ask her for a divorce next week, after his company's merger was finalized. He'd rehearsed the speech, a cold, corporate-style severing of ties. He'd imagined her tears, her anger. He had not, in his wildest nightmares, imagined this violent, fiery end. He sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, his head in his hands, the performance over. He was alone with the chilling reality of what he had wished for, and the horrific way it had been granted. The days that followed were a masterclass in public grieving. Joel issued a statement, crafted by his PR team, about the loss of his beloved wife and unborn child. He received condolences from business partners and society acquaintances, each call a fresh twist of the knife. In the vast, echoing silence of the Sausalito mansion, he and Avery existed in a strange limbo, their illicit affair now shrouded by a tragedy that was both real and a convenience. The power imbalance that had defined their relationship was now starkly illuminated. Avery, a talented but struggling art curator, had been entirely dependent on Joel's patronage. He funded her gallery, paid for her apartment, and curated her social circle. In return, she had offered him adoration, a youthful antidote to what he saw as Jean's increasingly critical gaze. Now she walked through Jean's house as if measuring it for new curtains. "Maybe we should pack up some of her things," Avery suggested one evening, her voice gentle but firm. They were in the living room, a space Jean had designed with warm woods and plush, cream-colored furniture. "It must be so painful for you to see them everywhere." "No," Joel said, his tone sharper than he intended. "Not yet." He felt a primal need to preserve the space, as if changing anything would be a final, unforgivable desecration. He was haunted by Jean. He saw her ghost in the garden, tending to her roses. He heard the echo of her laugh in the hallways. The guilt was a physical presence, a weight on his chest that made it difficult to breathe. Avery's attempts at comfort felt cloying, invasive. She tried to cook for him, but her food tasted bland after years of Jean's vibrant, flavorful meals. She tried to initiate intimacy, but her touch felt foreign, a trespass against his grief and a reminder of his betrayal. Their secret, once a thrilling escape, was now a shared prison cell. One afternoon, while searching for a stock certificate in the shared home office, Joel found a small cedar box tucked away on a high shelf in Jean's closet. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, were a pair of hand-knitted baby booties, a soft, buttery yellow. Beneath them was a leather-bound journal. His heart seized. He opened it, his hands trembling. Jean's elegant script filled the pages. He read the first entry, dated 6 months prior, October 12th. "I saw them today, at that little Italian place on Chestnut Street. He was looking at her the way he used to look at me. My heart didn't break. It just stopped. For a full minute, I think I forgot how to breathe. The baby kicked, as if to remind me I wasn't alone." He slammed the journal shut, his breath catching in his throat. She knew. For 6 months, she had known. The entire dynamic of their last few months together shifted in his mind. Her silences hadn't been passive, they had been observant. Her sadness hadn't been weakness. It had been a quiet, profound mourning for a marriage that was already dead. That night, the first major fissure in his new reality appeared. "My lease is up next month," Avery said, swirling the wine in her glass. "It doesn't make sense to renew it. I thought I could move my things here. Quietly, of course. No one has to know for a while." "Absolutely not," Joel snapped. Avery's face fell. "Joel, be reasonable. We're together now. This is our home. This is her home," he thundered, the words ripping from his throat. "This is the home my wife built. You think you can just waltz in and take her place?" The color drained from Avery's face. "Her place? Is that what I am to you, Joel? A replacement? I thought you loved me. I thought this was what you wanted." "What I wanted," he scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "I wanted a divorce, Avery, not a funeral. I wanted to untangle my life, not set it on fire." Her eyes filled with tears, but a hard, calculating glint remained. "You may have the money, Joel, But don't you forget that I was the one you came to every night. I was the one who listened. I know all your secrets. You need me." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw not the carefree artist he'd fallen for, but a woman whose ambition was as sharp and ruthless as his own. The power he'd always held over her was an illusion. In this house of ghosts they were both trapped, circling each other, the unspoken truths between them far more dangerous than the lies they told the world. The call from Detective Harding came a week after the crash. "Mr. Davis, we need you to come down to the coroner's office. There are some discrepancies with the identification." Joel's blood ran cold. Discrepancies? He'd assumed the formal identification was a procedural nightmare he could avoid, that dental records recovered from the wreckage would suffice. He drove to the morgue in a daze, the pristine interior of his Tesla a stark contrast to the turmoil in his soul. The coroner's office was a place of sterile, antiseptic dread. Detective Harding met him in a small, windowless waiting room, his expression unreadable. "Joel, have a seat." The use of his first name set him on edge. A woman in a white coat, Dr. Evans, entered, holding a manila folder. She had kind eyes that seemed entirely out of place in this environment. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice gentle, "I am so sorry for your loss. This is an incredibly difficult situation, and I'm afraid I have some news that may be confusing." Joel braced himself. "What is it?" "We initially made a preliminary identification based on partial dental records found at the scene, which matched those of your wife, John Wilson," Dr. Evans explained, choosing her words with care. "However, standard protocol requires a DNA confirmation, especially in cases of fire. We ran the sample against a DNA profile we got from your wife's hairbrush, provided by your housekeeper." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Davis, the DNA is not a match. The person in that car was not your wife." The world tilted on its axis. The air in the room seemed to thin, the fluorescent lights buzzing with an unbearable intensity. "What? That's impossible. Her purse, her ID was in the car." "We're aware of that," Harding interjected, his voice flat, "which raises a lot of questions." Dr. Evans continued, her voice soft but insistent. "There's more. The victim was a woman, likely in her late 30s, but she was not pregnant, and the final autopsy report indicates that the cause of death was not the fire or the crash itself. She died from a massive coronary event, a heart attack, likely several hours before the crash." Joel stared at them, his mind refusing to process the information. Not John, not pregnant. Died before the crash. It was a cascade of impossibilities. "So who was in the car?" "We don't know yet," Harding said, his eyes boring into Joel's. "But we're running her DNA through the national database. What we do know is that your pregnant wife, John Wilson, is officially a missing person, and the scene of her disappearance is now a potential homicide." Harding's implication was clear. This was no longer a tragic accident. It was a crime scene, and he was the prime suspect. Joel stumbled out of the coroner's office and into the glaring California sun, his carefully constructed world shattered. He drove home on autopilot, the conversation replaying in his mind, each word a shard of glass. He found Avery in the garden, snipping one of Jean's prized roses. She looked up, smiling, a picture of domestic bliss that was now grotesque. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile faltering at the look on his face. "Joel, you're scaring me." "It wasn't her," he whispered, the words feeling alien on his tongue. "What do you mean?" "The body in the car, it wasn't Jean." Avery dropped the shears, her eyes widening in disbelief. What are you talking about? That's crazy. It has to be her. The DNA doesn't match, he yelled, the sound raw and desperate. She wasn't pregnant. She was dead before the crash even happened. The police think she's a missing person, Avery. A missing person. And they think I had something to do with it. A look of pure, unadulterated fear washed over Avery's face. The relief they had both secretly felt was gone, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. Jean wasn't dead. She was out there, somewhere. The implications were staggering. Had she been kidnapped? Or, a more chilling thought began to form in Joel's mind, had she orchestrated this? The quiet, compliant wife he thought he knew was suddenly a terrifying enigma. She hadn't been a victim in a car crash. She was a ghost who had just set their world on fire and vanished into the smoke. The story exploded. Tech millionaire's pregnant wife vanishes, mystery body in wreckage. News vans camped outside the gates of the Sausalito estate. Paparazzi followed Joel's every move. His face, grim and haggard, was plastered across every news site and tabloid, the headline always some variation of "The Grieving Husband." His world, once insulated by wealth, was now a public spectacle. The board of his company, Innovate Dynamics, called an emergency meeting. Whispers followed him down the hallways of his own office building. His carefully curated image was crumbling, and with it, his empire. The merger he'd been working on was put on indefinite hold. Joel's grief, a complex and confusing emotion from the start, had now curdled into a potent mix of fear and paranoia. He was no longer mourning a dead wife. He was being haunted by a living one. Every creak of the old house at night made him jump. Every unknown number on his phone sent a jolt of anxiety through him. Was it her? Was she watching him? He hired the best private investigator money could buy, a grizzled ex-SFPD detective named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man who operated in shades of grey, with a network of contacts that reached into every dark corner of the city. "She outplayed you, Mr. Davis," Thorne said bluntly during their first meeting in Joel's sanitized office. "Whoever your wife is, she's not the woman you thought you married. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a corporate takeover of her own life." The phrase struck a chord with Joel. He began to see Jean not as the gentle artist he'd betrayed, but as a brilliant strategist, a formidable opponent. He started looking at their life together through this new lens. Her sudden interest in his offshore accounts a few months back, which he'd dismissed as idle curiosity. Her insistence on a post-nuptial agreement last year, citing a desire for personal security, which he'd found oddly charming at the time. He went back to her journal, devouring the pages he'd been too cowardly to read before. The entries were a revelation. They chronicled her discovery of his affair with Avery in cold, meticulous detail. November 5th. He left his credit card statement on the desk. L'Auberge du Soleil. A table for two. I wasn't with him. The charge was from the same night he told me he was working late on the merger. The lies are so lazy. It's insulting. December the 1st. I followed them. He bought her a painting from the gallery he funds. My money. Our money. He touched her arm, and in that one gesture, I saw our entire marriage collapse into dust. The baby is the only real thing left. I will protect this child from his poison. The journal was not a record of heartbreak. It was a battle plan. It detailed her quiet liquidation of assets she was entitled to under their prenup, her research into countries with no extradition treaties with the United States, and her careful cultivation of a new identity. Joel felt a chilling admiration for her audacity. She hadn't just left him. She had executed a flawless escape, framing it as her own death to buy herself time. Meanwhile, Avery was unraveling. The dream of becoming Mrs. Joel Davis, the Queen of San Francisco society, had turned into a waking nightmare. She was now the other woman in a national scandal. Her gallery was failing, her patrons disappearing. "We have to do something," she hissed at Joel one night, her voice frayed with panic. "We need to control the narrative. Go on TV, tell them how much you love her, how desperate you are to find her." "And what do I say when they ask about you, Avery?" Joel shot back, his patience worn thin. "Do I tell them about our romantic getaways while my pregnant wife sat at home alone? Do I tell them you were practically measuring for drapes the day after she died?" The accusation hung between them, ugly and true. The trust, already fragile, was completely gone. They were no longer partners in a secret love affair, but two co-conspirators tied to a sinking ship, each clawing at the other to stay afloat. Joel looked at the panic in her eyes and saw not love or concern, but the terrifying reflection of his own desperation. He was being hunted, not just by the police and the media, but by the ghost of a woman who was smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than he had ever imagined. Joel poured himself a third glass of scotch and opened the journal again. The house was deathly quiet, Avery having retreated to a guest room after their last explosive fight. With Marcus Thorne's words echoing in his head, Joel sought to understand the architect of his ruin. He turned to a section near the end of the journal, the pages filled with Jeanne's precise, elegant script, a stark contrast to the chaos of her plan. January 22nd. The pieces are coming together. It feels like directing a play, and all the actors are unaware of their roles. My biggest challenge was the body, a tragic necessity. I needed a fire, something to obscure identity long enough for me to disappear. I needed a Jane Doe. Joel read on, captivated and horrified. The diary detailed Jeanne's volunteer work over the past year at a city-run hospice. It was a detail he'd barely registered, dismissing it as one of her charitable hobbies. But it was there she had met a morgue attendant named Hector, a kind, lonely man burdened by the anonymity of the unclaimed bodies that passed through his morgue. February 15th. I spoke with Hector today. There's a woman, Eleanor Vance. No family, no friends. She's been in the city morgue for 2 months. Her records show a history of heart disease. She matches my general height and build. Hector is hesitant, but he sees the pain in my eyes. I told him a partial truth, that I was escaping an abusive husband, that I feared for my baby's life. He believes me. People are good, Joel. That's something your cynicism will never let you understand. The level of meticulous planning was staggering. The diary described how she used a burner phone to coordinate with Hector. On the night of the crash, he had signed out Eleanor Vance's body for a late-night transfer to a crematorium, a transfer that would never happen. Jean met him in a desolate parking lot, the body wrapped in a blanket in the back of his van. She'd paid him enough cash to start a new life somewhere far away, a small price for her own. March 5th. Staging the scene was the hardest part. I drove my car, my beautiful, ridiculous cage, to the overlook on Panoramic Highway. I put Eleanor in the driver's seat. It felt profoundly wrong, a violation. I whispered an apology to her, a promise that I would live a life worthy of this second chance. I placed my purse on the passenger seat, my wallet and ID inside. Then I poured the gasoline. The smell will stay with me forever. I used a simple timed igniter, a trick I learned from an old movie. As I walked away into the darkness, I didn't look back. I couldn't. The final entries were written from a hotel room near SFO. They were a mix of resolve, fear, and a deep, aching sadness for the man she had once loved. March 6th. It's done. By the time they find the car, I will be on a flight to Lisbon. I chose Portugal for its beauty, its quiet grace, and its lack of an extradition treaty. I'm not a criminal, but I know Joel. When he realizes what I have done, his pride will be wounded, and he will come for me with all the power his money can buy. He won't come with love, but with rage. He'll want to possess me, to punish me for my audacity. My only regret is this child will never know her father. But the man I married died long ago. He was replaced by a hollow man, a man who values acquisitions over affection. I am not destroying our family, Joel. I am saving what's left of it. Mew and this baby. We are what's left. Joel closed the journal, the leather cool against his clammy hands. The scotch offered no comfort. He felt stripped bare, his entire perception of his marriage, of his wife, incinerated. He had seen her as a beautiful, passive object. His wife, the artist, the mother of his child-to-be. A part of his portfolio of success. He had never once considered the fierce, brilliant and wounded woman underneath. He had underestimated her profoundly, and in doing so, he had not only lost her, but he had also unleashed a force he could never hope to control. The diary wasn't just a collection of secrets. It was a verdict, and it had found him guilty on all counts. The investigation was stalled. The police had identified the body of Eleanor Vance, but her trail was a dead end. The pressure on Joel was immense, but with no evidence linking him to either John's disappearance or Eleanor's death, Detective Harding was left with little more than suspicion. It was Marcus Thorne, the PI, who finally broke the case open, but the culprit he found wasn't the one Joel expected. "I've been digging into Avery Reed," Marcus said, sliding a folder across the polished surface of Joel's desk. "You were so focused on your wife, you never looked at the person sleeping in her house." Inside the folder were financial records and phone logs. They showed a series of cash withdrawals made by Avery in the weeks before the crash, and several calls to a man named Leo Gallo, a low-level thug with a record for assault and intimidation. The final piece was a location ping from Leo Gallo's burner phone. On the night of the crash, it had been on Panoramic Highway, less than a mile from the overlook. "Avery wasn't planning to move into your life, Mr. Davis," Marcus said, his voice grim. "She was planning a hostile takeover." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Joel arranged to meet Avery for dinner at Quint's, a restaurant so public and formal she wouldn't dare make a scene. She arrived looking radiant, a desperate attempt to project an image of stability and unity for the ever-present paparazzi outside. "Isn't this nice?" she said, smiling as the waiter poured their water. "Getting out, feeling normal for a night." Joel waited until their appetizers arrived. "I know about Leo Gallo, Avery." The smile froze on her face. Her fork clattered against her plate. I don't know who that is." "Don't lie to me," Joel said, his voice dangerously low. "My PI is very thorough. He knows about the cash withdrawals. He knows about the phone calls. He knows you paid Gallo to be on that highway the night Jean disappeared." The color drained from her cheeks. She looked around, her eyes wide with panic. "Joel, listen to me. It wasn't what you think." "Then what was it?" he pressed, leaning forward. "An unfortunate coincidence?" Her facade crumbled, replaced by a raw, desperate honesty. "I just wanted to scare her. That's all. I hired him to run her off the road, just a little bit. Enough to shake her up." Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Enough to cause a complication with the pregnancy." Joel felt a profound wave of nausea. This whole time, he had been the villain of the story, the unfaithful husband whose actions drove his wife away. But there was another betrayal, another layer of darkness he had never seen. "You wanted her to lose the baby," he stated, the words tasting like poison. "My child," "Our child," she hissed back, her composure gone. "I was supposed to be the one to give you a child, Joel, an heir. She was in the way. She and her baby were an obstacle to the life you promised me." Her confession laid her ambition bare. She hadn't been in love with him. She had been in love with his life, his name, his power. She saw Jean not as a person, but as a position she was entitled to. In her mind, the baby was a strategic threat to her own ascendancy. "You were preempted, weren't you?" Joel realized aloud, a cold horror dawning on him. Jean's plan, her staged accident, it happened before your thug could even get to her. She saved herself from you. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted. He, the great Joel Davis, the master of the universe, had been a pawn in a vicious game between two women, one fighting for her freedom, the other for a crown. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance and guilt that he had failed to see the viper he'd invited into his bed. He stood up, throwing a few $100 bills on the table. "You are a monster, Avery." He walked away, leaving her alone at the table, the architect of a failed coup. He felt no triumph, no anger, only a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. He was utterly, completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he had single-handedly destroyed. The next morning, Joel walked into the SFPD headquarters and handed Detective Harding a file containing everything Marcus Thorne had uncovered on Avery Reed. He answered Harding's questions with a detached, clinical precision, laying out the timeline of Avery's withdrawals, her calls to Leo Gallo, and her confession at the restaurant. Avery's arrest was a media spectacle. She was photographed being led from her gallery in handcuffs, her face a mask of shocked indignation. The narrative shifted instantly. Joel Davis was no longer the prime suspect, but another victim of a conniving mistress. Sympathy, a foreign concept to him for months, began to trickle back his way. But Joel found no relief, no satisfaction in Avery's downfall. It was just another body in the wreckage he had created. He retreated to the mansion, now a monument to his failures. The silence was no longer just quiet. It was accusatory. Every room held a memory of Jean, every object a testament to a happiness he had carelessly discarded. He hit rock bottom. The days blurred into a haze of expensive scotch and sleepless nights. He stopped going to the office, ignoring the frantic calls from his board. He was adrift in a sea of regret, haunted by the final words of Jeanne's diary. "The man I married died long ago." It was Marcus Thorne who pulled him from the brink. The PI let himself into the house one afternoon to find Joel unshaven, drunk, and staring blankly at a television screen, flashing images of Avery's arraignment. "This is a pathetic look for you, Davis," Marcus said, his voice devoid of pity. He switched off the TV. "Your wife beat you. Your mistress played you. The world thinks you're either a killer or a fool. You can either drown in this expensive mausoleum, or you can decide what kind of man you're going to be from now on." The words were brutal, but they were true. For the first time in months, something pierced through the fog of Joel's self-pity. He looked around the room, at the life he had built and the life he had shattered. He was the common denominator in all of it. His ambition, his infidelity, his monumental ego. The next day, he started to clean up his own mess. He called his lawyers, not to fight, but to surrender. He convened a press conference. Standing before a wall of cameras, looking tired but sober, he did the one thing no one expected. He took responsibility. "My wife, Jean Wilson, is a brilliant and courageous woman," he began, his voice steady. Her disappearance was not the result of foul play, but an act of self-preservation. She left because I betrayed her trust, our marriage, and the family we were supposed to build. My infidelity created a toxic environment, not just for her, but for others, like Avery Reed, who was driven by a desperation that I helped to create. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for pity. He laid his failings bare for the world to see. He announced he was taking an indefinite leave of absence as CEO of Innovate Dynamics to focus on addressing my profound personal failings. In the weeks that followed, he began the quiet, unglamorous work of dismantling his own empire. He sold his shares in the company, his fleet of cars, his vacation homes. He wasn't trying to hide his assets. He was liquidating them, converting his soulless fortune into something tangible, something that could be used for good. He funneled the money, hundreds of millions of dollars, into a single, irrevocable trust. A trust in the name of the only two people who mattered now, Jean Wilson and her unborn child. It wasn't a bid to win her back. It was an act of penance. Marcus Thorne's reach was long. 2 months after Joel's public confession, the PI found her. "Lisbon," he said over the phone. "She's living in the Alfama district. She has a daughter. Born 6 weeks ago. A daughter." The words hit Joel with the force of a physical blow. A daughter he had never seen, whose birth he had missed, whose life he had already so profoundly damaged. He knew he had no right to see her, no right to disrupt the peaceful new life Jean had built. But he had to try, not for reconciliation, but for a final, necessary closure. He flew to Portugal with no entourage and no agenda. He checked into a modest hotel and walked the cobblestone streets of Lisbon, a city vibrant with a life he felt he didn't deserve. He found her address, a charming apartment with a small balcony overflowing with bougainvillea. He didn't knock. Instead, he wrote a letter, his hand unsteady. He told her he was in Lisbon. He explained the trust fund he had set up, emphasizing that it came with no strings attached, no expectations. It was simply what she and their daughter were owed. "I would give anything to see my daughter, even just once," he wrote. "But I will understand completely if you say no. Your peace is more important than my closure. Whatever you decide, I wish you a lifetime of the happiness I took from you." He left the letter with the concierge and waited. For 2 days, he heard nothing. He was preparing to fly home, his quiet request denied, when a text message lit up his phone. It was from an unknown number. "Praça da Alegria, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late." The next morning, he found her sitting on a bench in the small, sun-dappled park. She looked different, stronger, more serene. The haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a calm resolve. In a stroller beside her, sleeping peacefully, was a tiny, perfect baby with a wisp of dark hair. Joel approached slowly, his heart pounding. "Jean." "Joel," she said, her voice even. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet finality. He couldn't take his eyes off the baby. "She's beautiful." "Her name is Hope," Jean said softly. The name was a punch to the gut. He finally met John's gaze, and for the first time, he let her see the full depth of his remorse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words inadequate but utterly sincere. "For everything. For the lies, for Avery, for breaking what we had. I am so sorry." He handed her a folder containing the documents for the trust. "This is for you, for Hope, so you'll never have to worry about anything. So you can be free." Jean looked at the papers, then back at him. She saw not the arrogant tycoon she had fled, but a broken man trying to piece himself back together. It wasn't the past he was trying to buy back, but a sliver of a decent future. She didn't offer forgiveness. It wasn't hers to give, and he no longer expected it. But she offered something else. "Thank you, Joel," she said, and a flicker of the warmth he remembered returned to her eyes. "This is a good thing you've done." They sat in silence for a few more moments, two strangers bound by a shared history and a child. Then she stood up. "We have to go." He nodded, knowing this was it. As she turned to leave, hope stirred, her tiny eyes fluttering open. For one breathtaking moment, her gaze met his. It was a fleeting, innocent connection that would have to sustain him for a lifetime. Jean pushed the stroller away, disappearing into the vibrant life of the city. Joel watched until she was gone, a profound sense of loss mingling with a quiet, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't happiness. It was peace. He had faced his reckoning, and in letting her go, he had finally, mercifully, unburdened his own soul. 6 months later, Jeanne stands on her sun-drenched balcony in Lisbon, laughing as hope takes her first wobbly steps toward her. She is surrounded by the bright colors of a new life, her past a distant memory, her future her own to write. She is resilient. She is dignified. She is free. Thousands of miles away, in San Francisco, Joel tutors underprivileged teens at a non-profit community center. His life is smaller, quieter, but more meaningful than it has ever been. Once a month, an anonymous email arrives containing a single photo of a smiling, growing girl named Hope. It is a quiet act of grace, a reminder not of what he lost, but of the one good thing that came from the wreckage. He has not found a second chance at love, but something far more valuable. A second chance at being a man of character. A quiet, hard-won redemption. This story is a testament to the strength it takes to start over, and the peace that comes from taking responsibility. If you were moved by Joel and John's journey, please like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a story of resilience, and subscribe for more tales of complex lives and powerful transformations.